My mom cheated on my dad, a girl shouted upon arriving at the police station, and everyone laughed. But when she told the details, the room was left in shock. The March sun scorched the asphalt of the town's main street, a forgotten place where adobe houses blended with dust and the distant bark of a stray dog. It was 3 in the afternoon, and inside the police station, a building with peeling walls and a fan humming uselessly, the air was as heavy as the heat. Officer Ramirez, a man in his 40s with a wrinkled uniform and a poorly trimmed mustache, tapped his fingers on the desk. Across from him, Agent Mendoza, younger but with dark circles under his eyes that betrayed sleepless nights, scribbled something in a notebook. The two had been idle for hours, with nothing to do but listen to the occasional crackle of the radio spitting static. "This is an oven," Mendoza grumbled, wiping sweat from his forehead with his hand. "When are they going to fix the air conditioning?" Ramirez let out a dry chuckle. "When the mayor stops spending the budget on his new truck, I suppose." In the back, a third figure, Officer Torres, a petite woman with her hair pulled into a tight ponytail, reviewed some yellowed papers. She was the only one who seemed to maintain any order in that chaos. The station was little more than a cramped room with 3 desks, a broken chair, and a town map taped crookedly to the wall. The phone rang now and then, but no one answered, unless it was absolutely necessary. It was a day like any other. Until the door burst open, the screech of rusty hinges made all 3 look up at once. A girl stormed into the room, her chestnut hair tangled and plastered to her face with sweat. Her sneakers were caked with mud, and the white t-shirt she wore had a dark stain on the chest, as if she'd run through bushes or fallen. Sofia, about 12 years old, was panting as if she'd run miles. Her large brown eyes were red from crying, and her hands trembled as she clung to the doorframe to keep from collapsing. "My mom cheated on my dad," she shouted, her voice breaking, loud enough to echo off the cement walls. Ramirez raised an eyebrow and stopped tapping his fingers. Mendoza let out a short laugh, more out of reflex than amusement, and Torres, from the back, peeked over her glasses with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. "What did you say, kid?" Ramirez asked, leaning back in his chair with a crooked smile. "My mom cheated on my dad," Sofia repeated, stepping forward. Her fists clenched tight, and tears rolled down her cheeks again. "I saw everything." "Everything." The silence that followed didn't last more than a second, but it was enough for the atmosphere to shift. Mendoza laughed again, louder this time, and turned to Ramirez. "Did you hear that? We've got the case of the day. What do we do, boss? Call family court or give her a candy?" Ramirez shook his head, still with that half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. He stood up, stretching his arms as if shaking off exhaustion, and walked toward Sofia with slow steps. He was tall, burly, and his shadow engulfed her completely when he stood in front of her. "Calm down, little one," he said, in a tone that aimed for kindness but came off condescending. "Let's settle you down a bit, okay? What's your name?" "Sofia," she answered between sobs. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing dirt across her face. "Sofia Guzman." "All right, Sofia Guzman," Ramirez continued, crossing his arms. "What happened? Tell me slowly, we're not in a rush." The girl took a deep breath, but the air didn't seem to reach her fully. Her shoulders shook, and for a moment it looked like she might collapse right there. Torres set her papers down on the desk and approached, frowning. She didn't say anything, but her gaze was more serious than the other two's. Mendoza, meanwhile, stayed slumped in his chair, arms behind his head, as if watching a live soap opera. "My mom," Sofia began, and her voice broke again. This morning, she was with another man." Ramirez let out a barely stifled snort and glanced at Mendoza. The young agent covered his mouth to keep from laughing again, though his shoulders still shook. Torres, however, took another step closer and crouched slightly to meet Sofia's eye level. "What do you mean?" "She was with another man?" she asked, her voice firm but without the mocking edge of her colleagues. Sofia swallowed hard. Her eyes dropped to the floor as if reliving it drained all the air she had left. "In bed. In my dad's bed. I saw them." The silence that followed didn't last more than a second, but it was enough for the atmosphere to change. Mendoza stopped laughing, though an awkward smile lingered on his face. Ramirez uncrossed his arms and scratched the back of his neck as if unsure what to do with that information. Torres kept her eyes locked on Sofia, assessing her. "Look, Sofia," Ramirez said, regaining control of the situation. "Those things, well, sometimes they happen between grown-ups, you know. It's not nice, but it's not something to come running here over. Where are your parents now?" The Guzman house on Belgrano Street, number 245, was a reflection of the town itself. Humble, worn, trapped in a time that seemed to stand still. The adobe walls, painted a faded light blue, were cracked from years of sun and rain. The big tree Sofia had mentioned, an old willow with twisted branches, cast an uneven shadow over the front yard, where patches of grass sprouted between dry dirt. Inside, the air smelled of dampness and reheated food, a mix of lentil stew and stale coffee that clung to the tattered curtains. It was Monday, a day that on any other occasion would have been routine. Javier heading out at dawn for the construction site, Sofia going to school, Laura staying behind to wash dishes or sweep the endless dust. But this Monday wasn't like the others. It was 7 in the morning when Javier got up. The mattress creaked under his weight as he sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his eyes with calloused hands. The grayish light of dawn filtered through the window, barely illuminating the room. Laura lay beside him, on her side, the sheet tangled around her legs. She didn't stir when he stood, nor when he dragged his boots across the cement floor to put them on. "You getting up today or what?" Javier said, his voice hoarse from sleep and tobacco. He didn't look at her as he spoke. He was busy searching for his belt amid the clutter on the nightstand. Laura mumbled something unintelligible and rolled over, burying her face in the pillow. "Stop making noise, will you? It's still early." "It's 7, he shot back, buckling his belt with a snap. "Someone's got to bring money into this house." She didn't reply. Javier huffed, grabbed his jacket from the hook and left the room without another word. In the kitchen, Sofia was already awake, sitting at the table with a cup of mate cocido she'd barely touched. She wore her school uniform, a wrinkled gray skirt and a white shirt with the school logo embroidered on the chest. Her backpack sat on the floor next to the chair, but she didn't seem in a hurry to leave. "Hurry up, Sophie," Javier said, ruffling her hair as he passed. "I don't want you late again. The teacher sent me a note last week." "I don't want to go," she muttered, staring at the cup as if it held some answer. Javier stopped, his hand on the back door's knob. "What did you say?" "I don't want to go," Sofia repeated louder this time. She looked up, and her brown eyes had a strange glint, as if she might cry or snap, or both. He frowned, but didn't say anything at first. He stood there, looking at her with that hard expression he always wore when he didn't know how to handle something. Javier wasn't a man of many words. His face, weathered by the sun and etched with premature wrinkles, spoke for him. At 38, he looked older, worn out by the construction job, the debts, a life that never gave him a break. "Fine," he relented at last, opening the door. "Stay, but help your mom with something. Don't spend the day lying around watching TV." Sofia nodded, though she didn't meet his eyes. Javier stepped out and the door slammed, rattling the wooden frame. Outside, the old Fiat's engine sputtered a couple of times before starting, and the sound faded down the street. The house fell silent, save for the tick-tock of the wall clock, a cheap plastic thing hanging crookedly above the sink. Laura appeared in the kitchen a few minutes later, wearing a faded robe that had once been pink. Her chestnut hair was a mess, and dark circles shadowed her face as if she hadn't slept in days. At 35, she still held traces of the beauty she'd had in her youth, but bitterness showed in her tight mouth and slumped shoulders. "What are you still doing here?" she asked, seeing Sofia at the table. "I didn't go to school," the girl replied, not looking up. "My head hurts." Laura snorted and headed straight for the kettle. "Always the same excuse. If you don't want to go, just say it and stop making stuff up." "It's not an excuse," Sofia protested, frowning. "I feel bad." "Sure, and I'm the Queen of England," Laura said, lighting the burner with a match that flared briefly. "If you're staying, at least help me with something. We need to wash clothes and sweep the yard. Your dad does nothing but complain, and I can't do it all alone." Sofia didn't answer. She kept staring at the mate cocido, now cold, while Laura made coffee in a cracked mug. The air between them was tense, as it had been lately. Once, Sofia and her mother had been close. They'd laughed together, played cards on rainy afternoons, shared secrets. But in recent months, something had shifted. Laura was distant, irritable, always with her phone in hand or slipping out for errands that took too long. Sofia noticed, though she didn't say it. Not yet. "You don't understand," Sofia interrupted, raising her voice again. Her eyes flared with a mix of fury and desperation. "It's not just that. Something else happened." "Something else?" Torres asked, narrowing her eyes. The girl nodded vigorously, and tears fell again, faster this time. "My dad. He came home after and I don't know what happened, but it was awful." Ramirez frowned and turned to Mendoza. "What time is it?" 3:15, the agent replied, glancing at the battered clock on the wall. "What time did this happen, Sofia?" Ramirez asked, turning back to her. "I don't know. Around noon, I think," she said, rubbing her eyes. "I was in my room and I heard noises. I went to see what was going on and I saw them, my mom and that man, and then my dad came." Mendoza straightened in his chair, finally losing that joking air. "And what did your dad do when he saw them?" "I don't know," Sofia repeated, almost shouting. "I ran. I was scared. He was so mad. I'd never seen him like that. He was yelling, and my mom was too, and then I don't know what happened, but something awful, I know it." Torres stood up and exchanged a look with Ramirez. The officer kept scratching his neck, clearly uncomfortable. In a town like this, family problems weren't rare. Fights over money, jealousy, booze. But something in Sofia's voice, in the way she trembled, made this feel different. "Let's see if I got this straight," Ramirez said, speaking more slowly, as if trying to organize his thoughts. "You saw your mom with another guy in your dad's bed. Then your dad came home. All hell broke loose and you ran here. Is that it?" Sofia nodded, but added, "It's not just that I saw them. It's that my mom didn't even flinch when I caught her. She looked at me like it didn't matter. And that man, he laughed. He laughed at me." That made Torres raise an eyebrow. Ramirez, meanwhile, let out a long sigh and turned to the desk. "All right, Mendoza, get the kid a glass of water. Let's all calm down a bit." "I don't want water," Sofia snapped, stepping back. "I want you to go to my house. Something happened, I know it. My dad, he's not like that. He never yells that much. And my mom, she was acting so weird, so weird." "Easy, easy," Ramirez insisted, raising his hands as if to stop her. "No one's going anywhere yet. First, we need you to tell us exactly what you saw. No rushing." "I already told you," Sofia shouted, her voice echoing in the room again. "My mom was with that man in bed, and my dad came and lost it. I don't know what happened after, but you have to go see." Mendoza returned with a glass of water anyway, but set it on the desk when he saw Sofia wasn't taking it. Torres approached Ramirez and spoke quietly, though not soft enough for Sofia to miss it. "What if something really did happen?" she murmured. "The girl's genuinely scared. It doesn't seem like she's making it up." Ramirez grunted something unintelligible and ran a hand over his face. "It's always the same. These things start with drama and end in nothing. The dad probably slapped the mom, they argued for a bit, and that's it. No need to make a circus out of this." "And if not?" Torres pressed, staring at him. The officer hesitated. He looked at Sofia, still trembling in the middle of the room, fists clenched and breathing hard. Then he glanced at Mendoza, who wasn't smiling anymore and seemed to be waiting for orders. Finally, he sighed again. "Fine," he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Sofia, listen to me. We're going to your house to see what's going on, but you're staying here with Torres. I don't want you getting into more trouble, got it?" "No," she protested, stepping forward. "I have to go. It's my house. They're my parents." "No, no, and no." Ramirez cut in firmer this time. "I'm in charge here and you're staying. Torres, make sure she doesn't move from that chair." Torres nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. Mendoza was already putting on his cap, ready to leave. Ramirez grabbed the patrol car keys from the drawer and headed to the door, but before stepping out he turned to Sofia one last time. "Where do you live, kid?" "Belgrano Street, number 245, she replied, her voice softer but still shaky. "It's a light blue house with a big tree out front." "Belgrano 245, Ramirez repeated, nodding. "Mendoza, let's go." The two men left, and the sound of the door closing left a heavy echo in the room. Torres approached Sofia and placed a hand on her shoulder, gently, as if afraid the girl might shatter at the touch. "Sit here," she said, pointing to the old, broken chair by the desk. "We'll wait for them to come back, okay?" Sofia didn't answer. She slumped into the chair, but her eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if she wanted to run after them. The officer's laughter had vanished completely. Now the fan kept humming, but the air was thick with something else, a tension none of them could ignore. The day dragged on, slow and heavy. Sofia helped hang the laundry in the yard, the sun beating down on her neck, while Laura swept the kitchen with harsh, jerky movements, as if fighting the broom. By 11, the heat was unbearable, and they sat in the living room with a pedestal fan that barely stirred the hot air. "Why don't you turn on the TV?" Laura said, flopping onto the couch with a sigh. "There's nothing good on," Sofia replied, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "It's all boring." "Put on the news, then. We need something to listen to." Sofia obeyed, though she didn't care. The old TV with its wire antenna took a moment to flicker on. When it did, a reporter was talking about a crash on the highway, but neither paid attention. Laura pulled her phone from the robe's pocket and started typing, a small smile on her face that Sofia hadn't seen in weeks. "Who are you talking to?" the girl asked, turning to look at her. "No one," Laura answered too quickly. She pocketed the phone and stood. "I'm going to lie down for a bit. If you want something to eat, there's leftovers in the fridge." Sofia frowned but said nothing. She watched her mother disappear down the hallway toward the bedroom, and the sound of the door closing left a knot in her stomach she couldn't explain. She stayed alone in the living room, the TV droning and the fan spinning uselessly. An hour passed, maybe more. The clock showed 1:45 when she decided to get a glass of water. The hallway was narrow, dark, with walls that smelled of dampness. The door to her parents' room was ajar, and as she passed, Sofia heard something, a murmur, a low laugh. She stopped, her heart beating a little faster. She pushed the door gently, just enough to peek inside. And then she saw it. Laura was on the bed, disheveled, her robe open to the waist. Beside her, A man Sofia didn't know. He was thin, with black hair and a scruffy beard, wearing a half-buttoned shirt and dirty jeans. He was propped up, one hand behind his head, the other stroking Laura's arm. They were laughing, as if sharing a private joke. The sheet was tangled at the foot of the bed, and the air reeked of sweat and cheap cologne. Sofia froze, her hand on the doorframe. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mother looked up and saw her but didn't flinch. Her eyes, bright and cold, locked onto Sofia's for an endless second. "What are you standing there for?" Laura said, her voice sharp, like she was scolding her for spilling something. The man turned his head and let out a chuckle, a high, cruel laugh that made Sofia's skin crawl. "Who's this, Lau? Your maid?" "Shut up," Laura snapped, but she didn't stop staring at Sofia. "Go to the kitchen, Sofia, now." "What? What are you doing?" Sofia stammered, her voice trembling. Her eyes darted from her mother to the man, and the knot in her stomach turned to nausea. "I told you to go to the kitchen," Laura repeated, louder this time. She sat up, yanking the robe closed with a sharp tug. "Now, damn it." Sofia stepped back, but she didn't leave. It was as if her feet were glued to the floor, as if her mind couldn't process what she was seeing. The man sat up a bit, still laughing, and winked at her. "Don't get all worked up, kid," he said, his tone twisting her guts. "Your mom and I are just chatting." "Shut up, I said," Laura shouted, shoving his shoulder. Then she looked at Sofia again, her eyes blazing. "Get out of here, Sofia, now." And then came the noise, a loud slam from the kitchen, the sound of heavy boots on cement. Sofia turned, her heart in her throat, and saw Javier coming through the back door. His jacket was dusty, his face red as if he'd run or argued with someone. He stopped short when he saw Sofia in the hallway, her eyes wide as saucers. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice deep, almost a growl. Sofia couldn't answer. The words stuck in her throat, and before she could move, Javier brushed past her and shoved the bedroom door open. What he saw stopped him cold. Laura, disheveled and half-naked, and the stranger who wasn't laughing anymore. The silence lasted a fraction of a second, and then everything exploded. "What the hell is this?" Javier roared, stepping forward, his fists clenched and the veins in his neck bulged like cords. "Javier, wait!" Laura screamed, leaping off the bed. Her robe fell open again, but she didn't seem to care. "It's not what you think." The man tried to stand, but he tripped over the sheet and hit the floor with a thud. "Calm down. Buddy, don't get crazy," he said, raising his hands as he scrambled toward the window. Javier didn't hear him. He lunged at Laura, his eyes burning with rage and pain. "Who's this bastard? What are you doing with him in my bed?" "Nothing, I swear," she replied, backing up until she hit the wall. "We were just talking, that's all." "Talking," Javier echoed with a bitter laugh that held no humor. "You think I'm an idiot, Laura? In my own house?" Sofia, still in the hallway, started to shake. Her father's shouts, her mother's pleas, the man climbing out the window like a rat. It was too much. She stepped back, then again, and when Javier turned to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the drawer, she lost it. She ran down the hallway, through the kitchen, across the yard, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get out. The chaos stayed behind, but the echo of the screams followed her to the street. The patrol car's engine roared through the dusty streets of the town, kicking up clouds of dry dirt as Ramirez drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping nervously on the armrest. Mendoza sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window with a mix of curiosity and annoyance. The afternoon sun beat down hard, and the heat inside the vehicle was stifling, despite the rolled-down windows. Neither spoke much. The hum of the engine and the screech of tires on cracked asphalt filled the silence. "You think the kid exaggerated?" Mendoza asked finally, breaking the tense quiet. He scratched his chin, where stubble was starting to peek through. Ramirez grunted, keeping his eyes on the road. They always exaggerate. It's family drama for sure. The husband yelled at the wife, she cried a bit, and now the girl's making a movie out of it. But she was really scared. Mendoza pressed, turning slightly toward him. I don't know, boss. It didn't seem like she was making it up. All kids get scared when parents fight, Ramirez replied, his tone more excuse than certainty. You'll see. We go in, calm them down, and we're out. 15 minutes, tops. Mendoza didn't answer, but his furrowed brow said he wasn't so sure. The patrol car turned onto Belgrano Street, a row of low, faded houses that seemed to melt under the sun. Number 245 was easy to spot. The big willow out front, its branches drooping like torn curtains, and the light blue facade Sofia had described. Ramirez parked sloppily, half on the curb, and killed the engine with a sharp twist. Let's go, he said, opening the door. Get this over with quick. The two stepped out, adjusting their caps. The yard was silent, save for the buzz of flies swirling around a tipped-over trash can. The front door was ajar, and from outside a low murmur drifted out, like someone talking through gritted teeth. Ramirez banged on the frame with his knuckles, hard, making the wood rattle. Hello? Anyone there? He shouted, with that commanding voice he used to take charge. Police, open the door. Nothing. Just the murmur, which now sounded more like a stifled sob. Mendoza stepped forward, pushing the door open with his palm. It swung wide, revealing the kitchen, an old table with mismatched chairs, a sink full of dirty dishes, and the wall clock ticking away, showing 3:30. But no one was there. Where are they? Mendoza muttered, glancing at Ramirez. The officer nodded toward the hallway. That way. Let's go careful. We don't know what's waiting. They moved slowly, their boots echoing on the cement. The hallway was dark, narrow, and smelled of dampness and something else. Something sharp Ramirez couldn't place right away. When they reached the bedroom door, they stopped. There it was. A low, broken cry mixed with heavy breathing. Ramirez pulled the flashlight from his belt, though he didn't turn it on yet, and shoved the door open with his shoulder. The scene hit them like a punch. Javier sat in the armchair beside the bed, head bowed, a kitchen knife in his right hand. The blade glinted under the light streaming through the window, but there was no blood, no damage. Just him, still, his shoulders trembling as if holding back something he couldn't release. In the opposite corner, Laura was curled up against the wall, knees to her chest, face buried in her hands. She was crying, a guttural sound that rose and fell like waves. The bed was a mess, sheets tangled and a pillow on the floor. What the hell's going on here? Ramirez said, stepping in with a firm stride. His hand went instinctively to the gun on his hip, though he didn't draw it. Drop that knife now. Javier looked up, slow, as if the words took time to sink in. His eyes were red, swollen, and his face glistened with sweat. The knife shook in his hand, but he didn't let go. I didn't do anything, he mumbled, his voice hoarse, almost inaudible. I didn't hurt her. I said, drop it, Ramirez repeated, raising his voice. He took another step, and Mendoza followed, staying to his right. Laura snapped, her head up, her hair plastered to her face with tears. Don't hurt him, please, she screamed, inching forward on her knees. Nothing happened. He didn't touch me. Ramirez glanced at Mendoza, confused. What's happening here? Someone explain, or I'm pulling out the cuffs. Javier let out a long, shaky sigh and dropped the knife to the floor with a metallic clatter. He ran his hands over his face, rubbing his eyes as if trying to erase what he'd seen. I found her with another guy, he said, staring at the ground. In my bed, in my own house. Mendoza stepped toward the bed, eyeing the rumpled sheets. Where's the guy now? He left, Laura answered, her voice cracking. Out the window. When Javier got here, he ran off like a rat. Ramirez uncrossed his arms and approached Javier, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "And what did you do?" The girl came running to the station saying something awful happened. What was it? Javier shook his head, slow, as if it weighed a ton. "I didn't do anything. I wanted to kill her, I won't lie. I grabbed the knife and thought about everything I could do, but I couldn't. I'm not like that." Laura let out another sob, louder this time and covered her mouth with her hands. Ramirez straightened up and turned to her, frowning. "And you, what do you have to say? The kid said she saw you with the guy, in bed. Is it true?" She didn't answer at first. She kept staring at the floor, her shoulders shaking. Mendoza stepped closer, impatient. "Answer, lady," he said, his tone harder. "We don't have all day." "Yes, it's true," Laura shouted, looking up suddenly. Her eyes were full of tears, but there was something else too. Something like fury. "I was with him, yes, but it's not what you think. It wasn't by choice." Javier lifted his head, and for the first time since the cops arrived, he looked straight at her. "What the hell are you saying?" he asked, his voice low but dripping with venom. "I saw you, Laura. I saw you with that bastard laughing like it was nothing. And now you're telling me it wasn't by choice?" "It wasn't like that," she cried, inching closer to him. "Listen to me, Javier, please. I didn't want it. I swear I didn't." Ramirez raised a hand, cutting off the argument. Hold on, both of you. Let's take this step by step. He pointed at Laura. "Explain what happened, and no stories. I'm not here to waste time." Laura took a deep, trembling breath and wiped her face with the sleeve of her robe. His name's Marcos. He's my boss. Or was, I don't know. I started working for him a few months ago at the store downtown. Cleaning, stocking shelves, that kind of thing. We needed the money, Javier, you know that. The construction job isn't enough, and the bills keep piling up. Javier clenched his fists, but stayed silent. Ramirez nodded, impatient. "Go on." "At first it was just work," Laura continued, her voice quieter. "But then he started asking for things, favors. He said if I didn't do it, he'd fire me. And I couldn't lose that job, not with everything we owe. One time I stayed late. Another time he asked me to go with him to pick up supplies. And today he told me to come here." "Here," Mendoza interrupted, frowning. "To your house?" Laura nodded, biting her lip. "He said he wanted to talk, that it was something important, but when he got here it wasn't to talk. He pushed me onto the bed and I didn't know how to stop him. I didn't want it, but he wouldn't let me go." Javier let out a bitter, cutting laugh. "You're telling me he forced you? That you had nothing to do with it? I saw you, Laura. You were laughing with him like it was a damn joke." "I wasn't laughing because I wanted to," she screamed, her voice breaking again. "I was nervous. I didn't know what to do. He was laughing, yes, but I wasn't. I was terrified. And then Sofia came in, and she saw me, and then you did." Ramirez scratched the back of his neck, uneasy. He looked at Mendoza, whose mouth was set in a hard line. "So what are you saying?" the officer asked. "That this Marcos was blackmailing you? That he forced you to bring him here?" Laura nodded, tears falling again. "Yes. I didn't want to tell you, Javier, because I knew you'd get mad. But I didn't know how to get out of it. We needed the money, and he knew it." Javier shot to his feet, making Ramirez and Mendoza step back instinctively. "Don't give me that crap," he roared, pointing a shaky finger at her. "If he was forcing you, you would have told me. I'm your husband, damn it. You didn't have to let that guy set foot in here." "I couldn't tell you," she shot back, standing too. She was a few steps from him, fists clenched. "You're always at the site, always tired, always yelling at me about money. When was I supposed to talk? When were you going to listen?" Enough, both of you, Ramirez barked, stepping between them with his hands raised. Sit down now, this isn't a boxing ring. Javier took a deep breath but didn't sit. He stood there staring at Laura, his eyes blazing with fury and something else, something like raw pain. Laura sank back to the floor, hugging her knees. Mendoza sidled up to Ramirez and spoke quietly. What do we do, boss? This is a mess. If she's telling the truth, the problem's not here, it's with this Marcos guy. Ramirez grunted, eyeing the couple. First, we get the kid out of the equation. Sofia's not coming back to this house until this cools off. Second, we need to talk to that guy, but not today. Today these two stay put. And the knife? Mendoza asked, nodding at the weapon on the floor. No blood, no wounds, Ramirez replied, shrugging. Nothing happened beyond the mess. For now, it's just a domestic dispute. Laura looked up, her face soaked. Where's Sofia? Is she okay? She's at the station, Ramirez said curtly. She came running to us, saying something awful happened. Lucky for you, it seems she exaggerated. Javier let out a shaky sigh and ran his hands through his hair. She didn't exaggerate, he muttered. She saw everything. She saw her mother with that bastard. How do you expect her to be? Laura covered her face again, and the crying came back. Louder. Ramirez glanced at Mendoza and jerked his head toward the door. Let's go get the kid and bring her to talk to them, but they don't move from here, got it? Javier nodded, though he didn't speak. Laura just sobbed, her body trembling, like it might break. The cops left the room, leaving behind air thick with anger and tears. In the hallway, Mendoza paused and looked at Ramirez. You think she's telling the truth? He asked, voice low. That he forced her? Ramirez shrugged, lighting a cigarette as they stepped into the yard. I don't know, kid. But if she is, that Marcos is gonna have a lot to answer for. And if not, well, this family's already broken either way. The cigarette smoke mingled with the dusty air, and the sound of the patrol car starting up filled the street again. The sun dipped behind the low houses of the town, staining the sky a dirty orange that mingled with the dust in the air. 3 days had passed since the chaos at the Guzman house, and Belgrano Street number 245 was quieter than ever. The willow in the front yard still cast its crooked shadow, but now it seemed heavier, as if the branches bore the weight of what had happened. Inside, the house was just as still. Dishes piled up in the sink, the wall clock ticking away at 6 in the evening, and the fan humming in the living room, stirring air that cooled nothing. Sofia sat in the kitchen at the table, a cup of mate cocido in front of her that she hadn't touched. She wore an old t-shirt of her father's, too big for her, and her chestnut hair fell messily over her face. Since the police brought her back from the station that fateful afternoon, she'd barely spoken. Her eyes, once bright and curious, were dull, fixed on an invisible spot on the wall. She hadn't gone to school, hadn't stepped into the yard, hadn't done anything but sit there, trapped in a silence heavier than the shouts of that day. Javier came in through the back door, his jacket coated in dust and his boots leaving streaks of dirt on the floor. He'd just returned from the construction site, as always, but this time he didn't say anything upon entering. He stood in the doorway, looking at Sofia, hands stuffed in his pockets as if he didn't know what to do with them. "Did you eat anything?" he asked at last, his voice rough and tired. She shook her head, not looking at him. Javier sighed and went to the sink, turning on the faucet to wash his hands. The water came out brown at first, as it always did in that house, and he cursed under his breath while scrubbing the grime from his fingers. "You need to eat, Sophie," he said, not turning around. "You can't sit there all day like this." "I'm not hungry," she replied, barely a whisper. Javier shut off the tap with a sharp twist and dried his hands on his jeans. He turned, leaning against the sink's edge, and stared at her. "Look at me when I talk to you, please." Sofia raised her eyes slowly, and they met his. There was something broken in that gaze, something Javier didn't know how to fix. He wanted to say more, but the sound of footsteps in the hallway cut him off. Laura appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the same faded robe she hadn't taken off in days. Her face was pale, dark circles shadowing her eyes, and her hair was a tangled knot she hadn't bothered to untangle. "You're back already?" she asked, looking at Javier. Her voice was flat, lifeless. "5 minutes ago," he replied curtly. "And you, where were you?" "In the bedroom," she said, crossing her arms. "Not much else to do here." The silence returned, heavy as a rock. Sofia dropped her gaze again, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. Javier and Laura locked eyes for a moment, but neither spoke further. They'd tried talking the night before, after the police left for the second time, but it ended in yells and tears. Now it was as if words had run dry, leaving only a void neither knew how to fill. "What are we going to do with her?" Laura said at last, nodding toward Sofia. "With who?" Javier asked, frowning. "With Sofia," she replied, raising her voice slightly. "She can't keep going like this, sitting all day staring at nothing. She needs to go back to school or do something." "I don't want to go to school," Sofia interrupted, looking up sharply. Her eyes glinted with something like anger. "I don't want to see anyone." "You have to go," Laura insisted, stepping toward the table. "You can't stay locked up here forever." "I don't want to," Sofia shouted, standing so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "I don't want them looking at me, asking questions. Everyone knows, Mom. Everyone in town knows what you did." Laura froze, as if the words had slapped her across the face. Javier stepped forward, raising a hand. "Lower your voice, Sofia. Don't talk to your mother like that." "Why not?" she shot back, turning to him. Her hands shook and tears started streaming down her cheeks. "You know it too. You saw her with that man in your bed, and now you're telling me not to talk?" "Because I'm your father." "Damn it!" Javier roared, slamming a fist on the table, making the cup rattle. "And I still run this house." Sofia flinched, but didn't back down. "You don't run anything. Neither of you does. Everything's broken because of her." Laura stumbled back as if trying to vanish into the hallway. "Don't say that, Sophie," she murmured, her voice cracking. "Please don't say that." "Why not?" Sofia replied, nearly screaming. "It's the truth. I saw you, Mom. I saw you with him and you didn't care. You looked at me like I was an idiot." "It wasn't like that," Laura said, shaking her head. "I swear it. Wasn't like that. I didn't want—" "Liar!" Sofia cut her off, stepping toward her. "You always lie. You've been lying for months. I saw you with your phone, sneaking out, saying you were going shopping when you didn't bring anything back. And Dad knew too, but he didn't do anything." Javier ran his hands over his face, taking a deep breath. "Enough, Sofia. Stop yelling. This isn't getting us anywhere." "Anywhere," she repeated, turning to him. "We're already nowhere, Dad. This house is a mess. Because of both of you." The silence returned, but this time it was different, charged with a tension that felt ready to explode again. Laura sank into a chair, covering her face with her hands, and Javier stood there, staring at his daughter like he didn't recognize her. Sofia took a deep, shaky breath and wiped her tears with her sleeve. "I don't want to be here," she said at last, her voice quieter but just as firm. "I can't." "What are you saying?" Javier asked, frowning. "That I can't live with you," she replied, looking straight at him. "I can't look at you without remembering everything. The yelling, that man, you with the knife. I can't." Laura lifted her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "What do you mean, Sophie? Where are you going to go?" "I don't know," Sofia said, shrugging, "but I can't stay." Javier stepped toward her, hands open as if to grab her. "Don't talk nonsense, Sofia. This is your home. You're not going anywhere." "It's not my home," she shouted, stepping back. "Not anymore. You two ruined it." Before Javier could respond, Sofia spun and bolted down the hallway. Her footsteps echoed on the cement, and her bedroom door slammed shut, rattling the walls. Javier and Laura stayed, in the kitchen, staring at each other, unsure of what to say. The clock kept ticking, and the fan hummed as if nothing had happened. That night, the town was calm, but the murmur of rumors flowed like dirty water through the streets. At the greengrocer's, Mrs. Marta gossiped with a neighbor while weighing potatoes. "They say the husband almost killed her with a knife," she whispered, lowering her voice as if someone might overhear. At the bakery, old Ruben told a customer that this Marcos is a scumbag, always messing with married women. In the plaza, a group of kids from Sofia's school laughed, spinning exaggerated tales they'd heard. That Javier chased the lover with a shotgun, that Laura ran off with him, that the police found blood in the house. None of it was true, but in a town like this, truth mattered less than the story. At the police station, Ramirez and Mendoza were wrapping up the case report. They'd gone back to the house that morning after a neighbor called about hearing shouts. But they found nothing new, just Javier and Laura arguing quietly, and Sofia locked in her room. "Domestic conflict," Ramirez wrote on the paper, his handwriting sloppy. "No evidence of physical violence. Case closed for now." "You think it'll stay like this?" Mendoza asked, leaning back in his chair with a cold coffee in hand. "No," Ramirez replied, lighting a cigarette. "These two will keep fighting until one leaves or they kill each other, but it's not our problem as long as there's no blood." "What about this Marcos guy?" Mendoza pressed, frowning. "The woman said he was blackmailing her. Shouldn't we look into it?" Ramirez let out a dry chuckle. "Marcos Diaz, from the store. Know who his brother is? Councilman Diaz. No one's touching him, kid. If you want to stir that pot, go ahead, but I don't play with fire." Mendoza grumbled but didn't push further. The station's fan hummed, just like the one at the Guzman house, and Ramirez's cigarette smoke filled the air with a bitter stench. In her room, Sofia sat on the bed, legs crossed, holding an old photo. It was from when she was 6. Her in the middle, grinning with a missing tooth, Javier on her left with a beer in hand, Laura on her right in a floral dress she no longer wore. They were in the plaza, the willow from their yard in the background, and all three looked happy. Now, that photo burned her fingers. She stared at it a while longer and tears came again, silent this time. "They weren't like this before," she murmured to herself, pressing the photo to her chest. Why did they change? There was no answer, just the sounds of the town outside. A dog barking, a motorcycle passing, the faint murmur of voices. That wouldn't stop talking about them. Sofia wiped her face with her sleeve and looked around. Her room was small, with peeling walls and a desk cluttered with broken pencils. Her school backpack sat in a corner, still packed with last week's books. She hadn't opened it since that day. She stood and went to the closet, pulling out an old jacket and a pair of worn sneakers. She set them on the bed next to the photo and took a deep breath. She didn't know where she'd go, but she knew she couldn't stay. Not with her father's, shouts still ringing in her ears, not with her mother's face staring at her from the bed with that man. Not with the whole town whispering her shame. She opened the desk drawer and took out an old notebook. She tore out a page and wrote quickly, her handwriting shaky. "I can't live with your lies. I'm leaving. Don't look for me." She left it on the pillow beside the photo and put on the jacket. The clock showed 9:30. Javier and Laura were in the living room, arguing again in hushed tones, but she didn't go say goodbye. She opened her bedroom window, which faced the backyard, and climbed onto the sill carefully. The night air was cool, and the town was dark save for the distant lights of houses. She jumped to the ground, her sneakers making a dull thud on the dirt, and looked back at the house one last time. Then she started walking toward the street, unsure if anyone would find her or if she'd vanish into the night.